A quiet village hides tangled lies and stolen names. Welcome to the Mysterious Casebook. I am your host, Alexander. I love seeing this community grow. Tell me where you're tuning in from today. Your comments mean the world to me. I always love reading them. Now let's begin. It was a rare and golden afternoon in St. Mary Mead, one of those late summer days when the air was heavy with the scent of roses and bees humming lazily over the flower beds. The village had gathered in the sprawling gardens of Colonel and Mrs. Arbuthnot, who were hosting their annual fete, a much-anticipated event marked by raffles, tea stands, and a certain amount of quiet maneuvering for social notice. Linen-covered tables were laid out with sponge cakes, seed cake, and cucumber sandwiches, and the sound of laughter floated over the hedges. Everything was as it always was in St. Mary Mead, which is comfortingly predictable. Miss Marple sat quietly beneath a linden tree, her pale blue eyes surveying the bustle with mild curiosity. She had long ago discovered that if one sat silently, preferably knitting or arranging a teacup just so, people tended to forget one was listening. It was astonishing what secrets could be overheard when one gave the appearance of not attending. Her knitting needles clicked softly, the delicate wool winding into a new pattern that occupied her hands, while her mind was free to wander. At another table, Mrs. Price Ridley was holding court, remarking on the Arbuthnot's new gardener, a broad-shouldered young man with a strikingly taciturn manner. "Not at all like poor old Sims," she declared, her tone sharp enough to cut into the Victoria sponge. One never heard a word from Sims, bless him, but this new fellow, there's something sly about the way he looks at people. "Oh, nonsense," countered the vicar's wife, Mrs. Clement, who, despite her naturally kind disposition, had little patience for Mrs. Price Ridley's endless suspicions. "He's perfectly respectable. I believe he came from a very good recommendation." Their conversation was cut short when a sudden cry echoed across the lawn. It was shrill, piercing, and completely out of place among the polite chatter and the clinking of teacups. Heads turned, conversations broke off mid-sentence, and for one frozen instant, the garden fete was entirely still. The source of the cry was quickly discovered. Near the tea tent, where the raffle tickets were being sold, Mrs. Arbuthnot herself stood rigid, her gloved hand pressed to her lips. At her feet lay a figure, a woman sprawled awkwardly on the grass, a silk scarf twisted about her neck. There was no mistaking that she was dead. The first murmur spread like a ripple. "Who is she?" That, oddly enough, seemed to be the first mystery, for the woman was unfamiliar to most of the villagers. Middle-aged, fashionably dressed, with auburn hair and a pearl brooch at her collar, she was not one of the regular summer visitors, nor a known resident. Her presence at the fete seemed as misplaced as her lifeless body upon the neat lawn. Colonel Arbuthnot, blustering with indignation, ordered everyone to stand back, for heaven's sake. The vicar hurried to fetch the village constable, while Mrs. Clement did her best to calm Mrs. Arbuthnot, who was trembling violently. All around, whispers swelled into gossip. "I saw her earlier, near the croquet lawn." "She asked me the way to the High Street," insisted Mrs. Price Ridley, already certain that she had been in close quarters with a dangerous woman. "She was talking to young Mr. Denham, the solicitor's nephew," added Mr. Badger, the grocer, with relish. "It looked like she knew him, if you ask me." Miss Marple did not rise from her seat. She merely observed, her knitting momentarily stilled in her lap. She had seen the stranger, too, earlier in the day. The woman had approached the cake stall, her eyes darting around the crowd in a way that suggested she was searching for someone, or perhaps avoiding someone. A curious detail, now that she thought of it. Most visitors at such events drifted naturally toward acquaintances. This woman had seemed ill at ease, an actor in the wrong play. The constable soon arrived, puffing and red-faced, his helmet slightly askew. He bent down, muttered a few awkward words, and finally declared, "Best fetch the inspector from Much Benham." This is no accident, mark my words." His words did little to settle the crowd. Instead, speculation flared even brighter. "She must have been strangled," cried Mrs. Price Ridley. "Nonsense! She fainted from the heat," insisted Miss Hartnell, though the evidence at her feet disagreed. Miss Marple's keen eyes noted the scarf. It was fine silk, knotted in a peculiar way, tight enough to constrict but oddly placed, as though it had been tied deliberately rather than caught by chance. The woman's pearl brooch glinted in the fading sunlight, and Miss Marple thought, just for a moment, that she had seen such a brooch before. But where? Within the hour, Inspector Crail from Much Benham arrived. A tall, serious man with a brusque manner, he quickly set about taking names and statements. The fete, needless to say, was over. Guests were ushered away, though not before exchanging hurried whispers and knowing glances. By dusk, only a handful of people remained in the Arbuthnot's garden. The inspector, the constable, the Arbuthnot's themselves, and Miss Marple, who was regarded as harmless enough to remain. The inspector frowned as he bent over the body. "Not a local," he muttered. "No papers on her either. Strange. Very strange. Someone must have known her, or she wouldn't be here. Indeed, someone must have." But the silence with which the villagers responded to his inquiries suggested either genuine ignorance or a very deliberate withholding of information. As twilight deepened and the body was removed, Miss Marple gathered her knitting and prepared to leave. Her expression was one of mild sadness, but behind her gentle eyes her mind was already turning. A stranger, dead in the midst of a village fete, a silk scarf tied too tightly, and an air of misplaced familiarity with someone who was not quite who they seemed. It was, she reflected, the beginning of a most perplexing game. By morning, the news of the stranger's death had run the length of St. Mary Mead as swiftly as sunlight moved across a hedgerow. The postmistress at the little exchange reported an unusual crackle of calls. One could almost hear the urgency in the pauses between "Hello?" and "Do you mean to say?" The boy from the bakery took twice as long on his round, for every doorstep detained him with questions. A robin sang on Miss Marple's garden wall quite as usual, entirely unruffled by human drama, but the village itself was stirred like a teacup after a teaspoon of lemon had been added, sharp, brisk, and a little sour. At the high street, Mr. Badger's grocery sustained a steady stream of customers whose baskets did not necessarily need replenishing. Mrs. Price Ridley, for once, bought no peppermints. She was too busy narrating. "I was perhaps the last person to see that woman alive," she pronounced, with the faintest tremor that made tragedy into a subtle form of importance. "I told the inspector so. She asked me the way to the lavatory, Imogene, and I thought, that is a woman not accustomed to country arrangements." Something foreign about the way she said it. Mr. Badger, who had never in his life considered a village convenience a sign of foreignness, nevertheless nodded. He wanted to tell her that he had seen the woman speaking to young Mr. Denham, the solicitor's nephew, but he was not sure whether this would brand him reckless or helpful in Mrs. Price Ridley's eyes. In St. Mary Mead, the distinction could be perilously fine. He compromised by saying, quiet she was, but quick with her eyes, as though ticking off a list. City sort. "She was a widow," declared Miss Hartnell decisively, arriving with the sound of her umbrella tapping the threshold like a judge's gavel. "I can always tell. The shoes were widowy, sensible heels, and that pearl brooch is very like a piece my cousin from Eastbourne bought after her bereavement. It's a widowy thing, pearls. Pearls, sniffed by Mrs. Price Ridley, are more likely paste than not in such cases." Across the lane, the Bluebell tea room set a small dish of seed cake in the window to tempt the undecided, and 3 tables filled in the first half hour of opening. The conversation, even in whispers, boomed and rebounded, so that speculation acquired the authority of fact by the time it reached the next ear. At one table, Mrs. Weatherby was certain the dead woman had attended Much Benham Market the previous week. At the next, Miss Larkin, who taught piano and watched her pupils' hands for evidence of laziness, was equally certain she had never seen the woman before in her life and had a talent for faces besides. Conclusive arguments were made on both sides, though the evidence was no more than a drift of impressions. At the vicarage, the vicar read his breakfast egg with care while his wife spoke, her habitual gentle common sense tinged with distress. "It's dreadful for the Arbuthnotts," Mrs. Clement said. "Poor Dora will never set a tea-table again without trembling. And the Colonel likes order. It's a form of kindness in him, keeping things settled for everyone. This will feel like a personal affront." The vicar, who knew the inclinations of his parish as well as he knew the Book of Common Prayer, nodded. "There is a sermon somewhere," he murmured, "about the easy exchange of gossip and the hard exchange of truth. Not too dour, but a caution." "And Miss Marple?" Mrs. Clement asked, not entirely without hope. "Did you see her face yesterday? So calm. She knows something, I think, but it is not the sort of thing one can ask directly." "My dear," said the vicar, buttering his toast, "the kindest mercy the Almighty grants to villages is Miss Marple's discretion." At that very time, in her rose-scented sitting-room, Miss Marple sat with her teacup cooling on a saucer and her needles moving in a gentle rhythm. Mary, her young maid, stood by with the vigor of youth, eager to report. "Such talk, ma'am. Mrs. Price Ridley says the woman was Spanish because of the scarf, which is foolish because that scarf didn't look Spanish. It looked like the sort of thing Miss Larkin would give a bad pupil for Christmas, a fine thing dear to the giver, but not to the receiver. Oh, and the inspectors had the constable in twice to ask what he saw, but Constable Reed says he only saw people's backs, running. People do so often show their backs when they are frightened," Miss Marple said mildly, and sipped. Her mind had returned to the knot in the scarf, neat and firm and placed too high on the throat. There had been nothing clumsy or panicked in it. Whoever tied it had known their business or had the habit of making precise, tidy fastenings. She thought of parcels in the post office, of hymn-book ribbons, of a shopkeeper's practice of tying packages in a way that could be undone quickly by the customer, but not by the wind. And the brooch. She could not let it go. Pearls in a little wreath, with a tiny twist at one side like a flourish pattern familiar to her in the way the faces of babies and brides and funeral wreaths were familiar after a lifetime in St. Mary Mead. There was a memory there, elusive as a wren in ivy. She did not chase it. She had learned long ago that one must sometimes let such memories return on their own, like a cat choosing its moment. Young Mr. Denham, meanwhile, had set off toward the high street with an air of anxious purpose that did not quite amount to a hurry. He was, he told himself, simply going to the post office and to the grocer's after that for his aunt, with eggs and a jar of marmalade. That was how it would look, and indeed it was what he did. And yet his mind kept turning back to the woman in the garden, with that fixed, intent expression as if she were late for a train of great consequence. At the counter, Miss Pottle, the postmistress, looked up from her stamps with the bright interest of one who considers herself the custodian of useful knowledge. "Morning, Mr. Denham. Stamps, are they? And a telegram form, perhaps?" She had a way of posing her statements as questions that allowed the world to contradict her, but not easily. "Only stamps," he said. He did not blush. He was too well trained by life for that, but he felt the heat rise behind his ears, which was, to him, worse. "And, a book of postal orders for my aunt." "Of course." Miss Pottle turned to the shelf. "Shocking business yesterday. Your aunt is a poor thing. She's not one for such commotion. I thought perhaps I saw that lady on Monday, but I may be mistaken. There was a bustle about the place because of the new parcel scale, and people forget the weight of things so quickly." "You're seldom mistaken," Mr. Denham said, which was true but also a convenient compliment. He left with his purchases, and with Miss Pottle's eyes following him. She was thinking, not unkindly, that Mr. Denham was a nice young man, if a little keen to assure everyone he belonged properly to St. Mary Mead. People who insist on belonging sometimes fear they do not. Inspector Crail had installed himself in the Arbuthnot's small library, which possessed, in addition to a heavy desk and a cracked globe, a horsehair sofa on which witnesses perched uncomfortably and told their stories with more enthusiasm than accuracy. Dr. Haydock had offered his preliminary view of death by strangulation nearer tea time than luncheon, with not enough marks on the hands to indicate a struggle of any length. "There's a kind of stillness to that sort of thing," the doctor said, "not insensitive to the horror, but clinical by long necessity. It happens quickly, if one knows how. I don't say anything about who did it, mind you, only that whoever did it didn't fumble." Colonel Arbuthnot bristled with injured dignity. "In my garden," he said, for perhaps the 5th time. "On my lawn. I don't insist on much, Inspector, but I do insist upon ordinary decency within my garden gate. My wife is quite undone." Mrs. Arbuthnot was not undone so much as taut, like a ribbon pulled around a gift and tied into a bow. "We had the trestle tables laid out with such care," she told the inspector, a faint whiteness around her lips. "And the raffle books are numbered. Dora Prescott and young Lucy Miss Larkin's niece took names, I'm sure of it. It cannot be that a woman came in without a ticket. We had a bowl for stray shillings for the roof fund." Inspector Crail asked to see the books. Mrs. Arbuthnot patted at drawers and called for Lucy, and discovered that in the flurry of clearing away, the small ledger had been set by the kitchen scales, and not by the household account book where she meant it to be. It appeared after half an hour, with butter smears on the corner, its pages stiff but complete. There were names, dozens of them, but among the familiar handwritings and neat payments there were 2 entries in a cramped, uncertain hand, one smudged, both without addresses. Mrs. North at 3 o'clock. E. Kirby at 20 minutes past. Lucy had not remembered those, and Dora Prescott had only a vague recollection of someone in a hat with a net, which described every 3rd woman over 40, in Lucy's view. "Mrs. North," murmured the inspector, considering. "E. Kirby. Well, we shall see." Outside, in the orderly beds where dahlias stood in disciplined colours, Evan Reed, the Arbuthnot's new gardener, crouched by the earth and pressed a palm to the soil as if listening. He was younger than Sims had been, and stronger by far. His hands were clever and quick, which one noticed with pleasure if one liked neat borders and disliked weeds. He had been quiet since the fete, not from sullenness, but from a kind of inwardness. Mary from Miss Marple's had met him at the lane and later reported to her mistress that he looked like a man who wished his thoughts would leave him alone. Evan recalled, unwillingly, the moment by the greenhouse when the stranger had passed. She had looked at him directly, and in that direct look there had been recognition. "Mr. Sims," she had said, as if she were making sure. It had annoyed him in an obscure way to be mistaken for the old gardener whom the colonel still praised on rainy afternoons. He had not corrected her. It was nothing, after all, a small nothing. Yet like a pebble in a shoe, it had a way of being felt. In the Bluebell tea room, the scum on the tea cooled into brown lace as theories proliferated. The woman, Miss Hartnell declared, was not Mrs. North at all. Mrs. North keeps a small boarding house in Much Benham, and I saw her once on a Wednesday, and she has chestnut hair of a duller shade. This one's hair had an auburn gloss. It is never the same with widows who die. They always overdo it at first and then regret such bright colours. "I heard," said Mrs. Weatherby, "that she told Dora she had lived in St. Mary Mead once." Years ago, but one would remember someone like that, wouldn't one? People return, murmuring Miss Larkin with ostentatious modesty, sometimes under other names. There are reasons. Miss Marple had come in quietly and ordered only hot water to refresh her tea leaves, which she had brought from home in a little packet. She listened, as was her way, with a pleasant serenity that encouraged a sense of being safe while one talked of an illusion that had led more than one person into indiscretion. "Names," she said gently, when there was a lull, "are rather like hats. They can be borrowed for an occasion, but they very seldom fit as well as their owners suppose." Mrs. Weatherby laughed, pleased to be addressed by Miss Marple. "Do you think she borrowed hers?" "I think," Miss Marple said, soft as crocheted lace, "that someone borrowed something yesterday. It may have been only the assurance of belonging. Very often people come to village fêtes to be seen to belong." "That young Mr. Denham," Miss Hartnell pounced, quick as a cat. "So eager to be useful. He was talking to her." "He is useful," Miss Marple replied mildly, "and very devoted to his aunt. As for the lady, many people spoke to her, I believe. Mrs. Arbuthnot, of course, and Mr. Badger, and the girl taking tickets. And you, Miss Marple," said the inspector's voice, for he had come in unobserved and stood now near the door, his grave features unsoftened by the cheerful checked curtains and the smell of currant buns. "You always notice those whom the rest of us overlook. Did you notice her?" Miss Marple folded her hands. She was the sort of person who did not soil her gloves readily and did not like to put her handbag on the ground, she said. But she had no handbag yesterday, which would make a woman like that feel quite naked. People who are used to being tidy grow distressed when anything is missing. It makes them move oddly, like ladies' maids when their mistresses ring out of turn. Inspector Crail considered this, then nodded. No handbag was found. "We are looking for it." "We found, however, nothing in her pockets but a handkerchief and a theatre ticket stub from London that was quite old." "Old stubs," Miss Marple murmured, "are like old invitations. One keeps them for company, not for use." "Something else," the inspector went on. "There are those who say they know her. Mrs. North, East Kirby, a visitor from Eastbourne last summer. Yet on examination, their certainty is with her. It is remarkable how many of us would rather know a thing than not. It is uncomfortable not to know," Miss Marple agreed. "But it is sometimes safer." When she rose to go, Mary fell beside her with a flushed importance. "I told Mr. Reed you said good morning," she confided. "He asked for charity in the talking line, which is a foolishness I told him I don't have much of. But he said, 'Did anyone tell you that the lady called him Mr. Sims?' I said I would not tell you because it would be gossip, and then I thought perhaps it would be a kindness because it might be a clue, and there's a difference." "There is," Miss Marple said, and thanked her. That evening at the vicarage, a small, well-brought-up meeting was held. The inspector, the vicar and his wife, the doctor, the Arbuthnot's, and Miss Marple sat in the lamplight while tea was poured, and the facts, halting and thin, were examined. The ledger with its 2 uncertain names lay on the table, a mute and unhelpful object. Dr. Haydock said quietly that the scarf could have been seized from the victim or brought for the purpose. It was impossible to be sure. Colonel Arbuthnot declared that no one of his acquaintances would bring a scarf to a fête for such a purpose. Mrs. Arbuthnot, hands folded, said very little. "Someone knew her, though," Mrs. Clement said, not without a tremor. "It is not as if one would travel to a village fête and die there by accident among strangers. Someone knew her. Someone thought they knew her," the vicar corrected gently. "Or someone wanted others to think so." Miss Marple, who had been quiet, looked down at the ledger and touched with the tip of a finger the smudged entry. "Misdirection," she said, half to herself. "That is the amuse-bouche of wickedness. Something delightful and small to set one's appetite the wrong way. A name can do it as neatly as a magician's handkerchief." She did not add the thought that sat delicately beside the others in her mind, that the little pearl brooch had been very like one offered as a prize at last year's church bazaar, a prize won by a woman with neat hands and a careful way of pricking pastry with a fork. If this was so, she would not claim without certainty that the matter was not one of strangers at all, but of a game played over years with pieces that had merely been rearranged. It was no more than a thread, and Miss Marple, who had dared to do so, left it for the moment where it was. Outside the window, the lane was quiet, save for a bicycle bell, a late rider hurrying home. The village, unsettled, placed its own small bets on truth and error and pushed another day forward. In the morning, there would be more talk and more confidence uttered on less and less knowledge. The inspector would set the early wheels of inquiry in motion. The constable would search hedgerows for a handbag, and Mr. Badger would remember yet another detail that perhaps he had earlier forgotten. Miss Marple, after a modest breakfast, would make a call or two where calls could be explained as kindness. For now, the vicarage clock ticked with an even, decent sound. The tea cooled. The ledger lay waiting for better eyes or better luck. And somewhere in St. Mary Mead, a person who had tied a scarf with neat, tidy hands counted on the village's appetite for certainty to hide a far more interesting sort of truth. The next morning dawned grey and unsettled, a thin drizzle drifting across the hedgerows of St. Mary Mead. It was the sort of weather that encouraged people to stay indoors, yet paradoxically, it also drew them out with umbrellas and excuses, eager to discover what their neighbours might say about the shocking events of the fete. By 9 o'clock, the high street was busier than usual for a damp Tuesday. Inspector Crail, with his purposeful stride and heavy notebook, had become a familiar sight in the village overnight. He called first at the post office, where Miss Pottle, prim and eager, had her account prepared. She explained again about the woman she might or might not have seen earlier that week. The inspector listened with grave politeness, making careful notes, though his expression suggested he had heard a dozen similar tales already. When he left, Miss Pottle wasted no time in telling the next customer, Mrs. Hartnell, how thoroughly the inspector had questioned her. Very particular he was about whether the woman carried a handbag, she declared. I said no, certainly not when she came into the office, though of course I may have been distracted by the new parcel scale. But I'm sure she would have had one at the fete. Ladies always do, except it seems this one did not. Meanwhile, Miss Marple had chosen a different path for her morning. She set out with her basket toward the vicarage, her pace unhurried, her appearance as ordinary as any gentlewoman taking the air. Yet her mind was busy, moving through the fragments she had collected. The scarf knotted with such precision, the absent handbag, the half-familiar brooch, and the curious circumstance of names entered without addresses in the fete ledger. Mrs. Clement welcomed her warmly. It has been such a business, she sighed, pouring tea. The inspector asked endless questions about the raffle. Dora Prescott remembered nothing useful, poor girl, and Lucy Larkin was in such a flutter she contradicted herself twice in the same sentence. But really, Jane, it is the Arbuthnot's I pity most. Imagine their fate ending in such a manner, Miss Marple agreed softly. Yes, dear, Dora does not notice things that matter. She remembers the pattern on a teacup, but not the expression on a person's face. And Lucy has her aunt's way of embellishing what she wishes to be true becomes true in the telling. Such traits are quite natural in young girls, though not always helpful to an investigation. The vicar joined them with his usual grave kindness. The inspector wishes to identify the lady quickly, he said. He thinks perhaps she was visiting someone in Much Benham. Yet so far no one has claimed her, and the police in London say they have had no recent reports of a missing woman answering her description. It is most unsettling. Miss Marple's eyes rested on the steam rising from her teacup. People do not simply appear and vanish without reason, she murmured. They are always connected to someone, if not in the present, then in the past. It is the connections that matter. Later that morning, Inspector Crail called upon the Arbuthnot's again. The colonel remained indignant, pacing his library with stiff military bearing. On my lawn, Inspector, I insist upon a swift conclusion. This village cannot be safe until the fellow who did it is in custody." Mrs. Arbuthnot, composed though visibly strained, added, "We had prepared so carefully. I cannot believe a woman could have entered uninvited, and yet if her name was in the ledger, we cannot say otherwise." Crail produced the book, showing the two uncertain entries, Mrs. North, East Kirby, neither with an address. "It may be one of these or neither." "Can you recall the lady yourself, madam?" Mrs. Arbuthnot frowned. "I saw her near the croquet lawn. She was speaking to a young man, Mr. Denham, I think." "Yes, he seemed to know her. Or perhaps I assumed it. One does not like to think strangers come alone." The inspector's eyes narrowed. "Mr. Denham, he was mentioned before. I shall have a word with him." And so he did, summoning the young solicitor's nephew to the vicarage study that afternoon. Mr. Denham, pale but composed, admitted he had exchanged a few words with the stranger. "She asked after the direction of the station," he said. "I told her it was a half-hour's walk. That is all. I had never seen her before." "Are you certain?" pressed Crail. "Several witnesses recall you in conversation. I assure you, Inspector, it was nothing. Perhaps others exaggerated." His tone was calm, but his hands, resting on the arm of the chair, betrayed a slight tension. Miss Marple, who happened to be present at the vicarage on the pretext of returning a hymn book, observed without comment. She noticed the way Mr. Denham's eyes flickered not guiltily, but cautiously, as if weighing each word. She had seen such looks before on small boys caught out in fibs about broken windows and on husbands asking too directly about the hour of their return. It was not proof of falsehood, but of caution, which in its way was nearly as revealing. Meanwhile, in the tea-room that same day, Mrs. Price Ridley spoke with relish of the gardener, Evan Reed. A strange young man, if you ask me. Quiet, yes, but too quiet. And that business of being mistaken for Sims, well, Sims was respectable. Everyone knew him. This one, I do not trust. I dare say he could twist a scarf in his sleep. Her words were carried across the room like crumbs carried by sparrows, until by evening half the village regarded Evan with suspicion. He himself kept mostly to the Arbuthnot's grounds, trimming hedges and staking dahlias, but his silence made him an easy target. People always distrusted silence. It suggested secrets. Inspector Crail, hearing of this, questioned Reed briefly. "Did you know the lady?" "No, sir." Reed's reply was simple, his voice low. "She spoke to me once and called me Sims. That was all." "Nothing else?" "Nothing else," he repeated, with a finality that discouraged further inquiry. Yet Miss Marple, hearing the account later from Mary, thought of the slight, involuntary frown that must have crossed the young man's face when mistaken for another. To be mistaken is often a small thing, yet for some it touches pride in a very particular way. By the close of the second day, the village was divided into camps. Some were convinced Mr. Denham knew more than he admitted. Others were certain the mysterious woman had come for Evan Reed. A smaller groups, led by Miss Hartnell, insisted she must have been an old acquaintance of Mrs. Arbuthnot's, returning to stir up some hidden scandal. In St. Mary Mead, such theories sprouted like persistent, prickly nettles and were seldom eradicated. Miss Marple listened, as always, without seeming to do so. She heard the eagerness with which people leapt to assign guilt and the pleasure with which suspicions were repeated. She knew that behind every loud declaration there was often a quieter truth waiting for someone patient enough to notice. That evening, as the rain eased and the clouds broke into a pale sunset, Miss Marple sat by her window, her knitting on her lap. She considered the day's talk, the ledger entries, the missing handbag, and the false certainties. And she thought again of the pearl brooch, its little twist so familiar. Somewhere in the village in her memory was the key to its owner, and when she found that key, she suspected it would unlock more than the question of a name. It would open the door to motive and, perhaps, to the murderer. For now, though, she was content to let the village play its game of misplaced identities. They would misremember, misreport, and misjudge. And in that confusion, the truth would quietly reveal itself if one had the patience to see it. By the third day, Inspector Crail had made his position clear. In his opinion, the case should proceed with urgency, and urgency demanded narrowing the field. He was not a man to waste time entertaining every whisper of village gossip. "We must look to those who had opportunity," he declared at the vicarage that morning, where he met with the Arbuthnotts, Dr. Haydock, and the constable. "Opportunity first, then motive will emerge." His words, carried back through the hedges and shop doors of St. Mary Mead, ignited another blaze of speculation. The villagers, for all their talk, were reassured by the thought of suspects being named. It lent the whole affair a tidy framework. A crime without suspects is chaos. With them, it becomes a puzzle, and puzzles can be solved. By mid-morning, 2 names circulated on every tongue: Evan Reed, the gardener, and young Mr. Denham. Both men were strangers in their own way. Evan recently arrived, and Denham recently returned, and in a village where roots mattered, those without deep ones were always the most vulnerable. At the Bluebell Tea Room, Mrs. Price Ridley spoke with relish. "The inspector will see sense. That gardener is the very image of guilt. Doesn't speak, doesn't smile, all strength and secrecy. You mark my words, he's hiding something." Miss Hartnell disagreed, though not out of sympathy for Evan. "It's Mr. Denham we should look at. He was seen with the woman, and he looked quite unsettled when questioned. Solicitors' clerks are slippery by nature. They know how to twist words." Miss Larkin, who prided herself on being more discerning, leaned in with an air of authority. "It is always the young men when one looks back at such cases. They think they can get away with it. A woman alone is vulnerable, and men like Mr. Denham knows it. Depending on it, the inspector will charge him before the week is out." At that precise moment, Evan Reed was bent over the borders of Colonel Arbuthnot's garden, his spade turning the damp soil. He worked steadily, silently, while in his mind he rehearsed the scene with the stranger. She had looked at him, mistaken him for Sims, and for an instant her expression had altered recognition or alarm or something else he could not name. That moment replayed itself endlessly until the sound of Mrs. Arbuthnot's voice pulled him back. "You needn't disturb the peonies just yet, Reed," she said, cool and composed. "Best tend to the roses by the wall. I want the garden to look neat when people come calling. There will be so many questions." "Yes, madam," Evan replied, and turned obediently toward the roses. He felt her eyes upon him as he moved. Was it suspicion, or merely the natural caution of a woman unsettled by tragedy? He could not tell. Meanwhile, Inspector Crail summoned Mr. Denham for a second interview. The young man arrived at the library with his aunt's encouragement. She insisted it was better to be open and cooperative. Yet there was a stiffness in his manner as he faced the inspector. "You spoke to the lady at the fete," Crail said. "You told us she asked for directions to the station. Did she give her name?" "No," Denham replied firmly. "She did not. Yet Mrs. Arbuthnot recalls seeing you in conversation with her for some time." Denham shifted. Perhaps Mrs. Arbuthnot misunderstood. "We spoke briefly, no more." Inspector Crail's pencil tapped against the page of his notebook. "You are certain you had never seen her before that day?" "Quite certain." It was an answer given too swiftly, Miss Marple thought, as she sat quietly in the corner under the pretext of mending a loose glove. Denham's certainty rang more of practice than of truth. She studied his manner, the way his hands rested carefully on his knees, the way his gaze avoided the inspector's for too long a moment. Not the signs of guilt, necessarily, but the signs of a man concealing something. After Denham's departure, Colonel Arbuthnot thumped the arm of his chair. "There, Inspector, What did I tell you? A slippery fellow, that one. It's as plain as daylight. He knew her. Or wanted it thought that he did, Miss Marple murmured, but so gently that only Mrs. Clement, seated beside her, caught the words. The inspector, however, was less inclined toward subtlety. Until we identify the woman, we can only work with what we have. And what we have, he said firmly, is that Mr. Denham was seen speaking to her and that Reed was mistaken for Sims. Both matters require explanation. Dr. Haydock cleared his throat. If you ask me, the thing is far simpler. Whoever killed her had strength. That scarf was drawn tight, very tight. A man's work, not a woman's. Reed has the arms for it, no doubt. He's strong enough to twist a neck in two. I'd put my money there. Miss Marple lifted her eyes from her glove. Strength is one thing, Doctor. But strangulation is not only a matter of force. It requires control, precision, and, in some cases, knowledge. Not every strong man could manage it without leaving more marks. Knowledge, eh? The doctor said thoughtfully. You mean to say someone practiced? I mean only, Miss Marple replied, that when one ties a knot too neatly, it speaks of habit rather than impulse. Some hands are used to making fastenings. One sees it in the way parcels are tied, or aprons, or even shoelaces. Her words passed over the inspector with little effect, for he was already planning his next step. But Mrs. Clement, listening, felt a chill of understanding. That afternoon, Constable Reed, in relation to Evan, returned with news. The missing handbag had not been found, though hedges and ditches had been searched. But we did come across this, he reported, producing a small theatre program, damp and crumpled. It was near the lane by the station, same as the ticket stub in her pocket. Some London theatre. Might be hers. The inspector seized upon it eagerly. Good. That gives us something. We'll send inquiries to London. But Miss Marple thought quietly to herself. Why keep an old program and stub unless one wanted to be reminded of a particular evening? Such tokens were sentimental, yes, but they could also be convenient for creating an impression. A woman who carried them wished to be seen a certain way. And appearances, Miss Marple knew, were seldom to be trusted. By evening, the village had settled into a sort of uneasy rhythm. Doors were locked earlier, curtains drawn tighter. In parlors and kitchens, the talk revolved endlessly around the two suspects. Reed, the outsider with strength, and Denham, the nervous young man with secrets. Each theory seemed sound until another came along to contradict it. At her own hearth, Miss Marple set aside her knitting and reflected. Both young men were suspicious in their way, yet neither explanation satisfied her. Reed's silence was that of a man who had been judged before and learned to endure it. Denham's caution was that of one protecting more than himself. But behind them both was the greater question. Who was the dead woman, and why had she come to St. Mary Mead? Until that was answered, all suspicions were but shadows on the wall. Still, shadows have their uses. They reveal the shape of things to come. Miss Marple, pouring herself a modest cup of cocoa, considered that the game of misplaced identities had only just begun. Those most eager to point the finger might, in time, find the finger turning toward themselves. The rain had cleared by the following morning, leaving St. Mary Mead washed clean, its rooftops glistening and its lanes damp, but brightened with a silvery freshness. Yet, within the minds of its inhabitants, no such cleansing had taken place. The murder at the fete lingered like a stain that would not wash out, no matter how hard the rain fell. Suspicion still clung to Evan Reed and Mr. Denham, though in different measures depending upon who was asked. Miss Marple, however, thought little of the public's suspicion. She had lived long enough to know that gossip carried more smoke than fire. In her experience, the truth of human behavior often hid not in grand declarations, but in overlooked details. The loose thread, the wrongly buttoned cuff, the silence when speech would be natural. On that particular morning, she carried her knitting bag to the village post office under the pretext of buying stamps, though she had quite enough in her writing desk at home. Miss Pottle was at her counter, as usual, arranging envelopes with the care of a jeweller placing gems. "Good morning, Miss Pottle," Miss Marple said gently. "I hope the excitement hasn't unsettled you too much." Miss Pottle, who secretly enjoyed being at the centre of so much inquiry, pursed her lips. "It is a dreadful thing, Miss Marple, though one cannot deny it has brought a certain liveliness. Everyone wishes to know what I saw, and I have told them the same, though I dare say they do not believe me." "Oh, but I do," Miss Marple said with reassuring kindness. "You notice things, I am sure. People in your position cannot help but notice." Miss Pottle straightened at the compliment. "Well, now you mention it, I did observe something peculiar at the fete. Not the lady herself, I was too busy with raffle tickets, but afterward, when the commotion began, I saw Colonel Arbuthnot with a small book in his hand. He slipped it into his pocket very quickly. At first I thought nothing of it, but later I remembered that Mrs. Arbuthnot was searching everywhere for the raffle ledger. It made me wonder." Miss Marple's eyes brightened with a spark of interest, though she concealed it behind her gentle smile. "How very observant of you, Miss Pottle. Of course, one mustn't jump to conclusions. Gentlemen often put things in their pockets absent-mindedly. Still, I wonder if Colonel Arbuthnot mentioned it when Inspector Crail questioned him." Miss Pottle shook her head. "He said nothing of it that I heard. But I noticed. I always notice." Miss Marple left soon after, thanking Miss Pottle for her time. As she walked back along the lane, her mind sifted through the details. A misplaced book, a hasty pocketing. It might mean nothing, or it might be another piece of the puzzle, one that the Colonel would prefer to remain unseen. That afternoon, the inspector convened another meeting at the vicarage. The room was warm, a small fire crackling in the hearth against the damp. Miss Marple attended, as did Dr. Haydock, the Arbuthnot's, and Mr. Denham, summoned again for questioning. Evan Reed had also been asked to come, though he arrived reluctantly, his clothes smelling faintly of earth. Inspector Crail placed the theatre programme on the table for all to see. This was found near the station road. It matches the stub found in the woman's pocket. We are tracing her movements in London. Until then, we must work with what we have. And what we have, he looked directly at the two young men, is opportunity. Mr. Denham, his voice strained but steady, repeated his statement. "I spoke to her briefly. I had no connection to her. I swear it." Evan Reed said little, only that he had been in the gardens all day, tending the flower beds. The Colonel harumphed loudly. "I say, Inspector, we are wasting time with these interviews." The woman was an outsider. Surely it was some quarrel from her own life that followed her here. St. Mary Mead is not a place for such brutality. Miss Marple's voice, quiet but clear, broke the silence. "And yet, Colonel, brutality finds its way into every place, however peaceful it may seem. Sometimes it is less a matter of where one lives than of what one conceals." Her remark drew startled looks, but she did not elaborate. Instead, she bent to her knitting with serene composure. After the meeting dispersed, Miss Marple lingered to speak with Mrs. Clement. The vicar's wife had been visibly troubled throughout, her hands fidgeting with her handkerchief. "Dear Mrs. Clement," Miss Marple said softly, "you noticed something on the day of the fete, did you not?" Mrs. Clement hesitated, then nodded. "It seemed so small, Jane. I hardly thought it worth mentioning, but now, perhaps it matters. When the lady was near the cake stall, she dropped a button, I think. I saw her stoop quickly, but I cannot say if she retrieved it. Later, when I looked, it was gone. A button." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. "What sort of button?" "A small one, dark, with a peculiar design almost like a knot in the middle. Not from her dress, I thought. Her gown had pearl buttons. This one seemed heavier, more masculine." Miss Marple thanked her warmly. A button, a brooch, a missing handbag, Sanjan's small, misplaced objects, each telling a fragment of the story. She tucked the thought away, for such fragments often revealed their meaning only when enough were gathered. That evening in her own cottage, Miss Marple sat quietly with her knitting and reflected. The inspector was pressing his case against Denham and Reed, yet she felt neither truly fit the pattern. Reed's silence, though suspicious to others, seemed more the silence of a man misunderstood than of a murderer. Denham's caution suggested entanglement, yes, but not necessarily violence. No, the truth was not so obvious. It lay, she felt sure, in the overlooked details, the colonel's pocketed book, the woman's dropped button, and the neat knot of the scarf. These were not coincidences. They were threads, waiting to be woven into a design, and Miss Marple, with her patient, delicate eye, had always been skilled at seeing designs in the tangle of human life. As the church bell struck 9, she laid aside her knitting, her thoughts already shaping the questions she would ask on the morrow. For somewhere in St. Mary Mead, hidden among ordinary things, was the clue that would begin to unravel the game of misplaced identities. The following day dawned with a faint mist curling through the lanes of St. Mary Mead, muffling sound and softening outlines. The village, however, was anything but hushed. Theories multiplied as freely as mushrooms after rain, and each villager had become a self-appointed investigator. In parlors, over teacups, and across hedges, opinions were exchanged with an air of authority. Inspector Crail, though a man of method, found his task hindered rather than helped by this flood of certainties. Yet beneath the chatter, Miss Marple sensed a new tension. It was as though the murder had unsettled more than curiosity. It had disturbed old dust, bringing long-forgotten matters to the surface. The game of identities was not limited to the unknown. Victim was seeping into the lives of the villagers themselves, unmasking what they preferred to keep hidden. That morning, Miss Marple took a deliberate walk to the Arbuthnot's garden. Evan Reed was working there, his spade striking the damp soil with steady rhythm. He looked up briefly as she approached, his expression guarded. "Good morning, Mr. Reed," she said pleasantly. "The roses are flourishing under your care." "Morning, ma'am." He bent again to his task. Miss Marple did not hurry. She watched the careful way he worked, neat and methodical, and said after a pause, "I hear that the lady who died mistook you for Sims, the old gardener. That must have been rather vexing for you." He stiffened slightly. "People make mistakes." "Yes, indeed. And yet sometimes mistakes tell us more than truths. She must have seen something familiar in you, something that reminded her of Sims. Have you ever heard of him?" "No, ma'am," Reed said quickly. "Never met him?" His tone was firm, yet Miss Marple noted the tightening of his grip on the spade handle. The denial came too swiftly, as if rehearsed. She left it at that, merely remarking that the roses would bloom beautifully for the harvest festival, and went on her way. Later that afternoon, Inspector Crail visited Mr. Denham at his aunt's house. The young solicitor's nephew tried to appear composed, but his aunt, Mrs. Denham, hovered in the background, her eyes betraying anxiety. "You maintain," Crail said, "that you had never seen the woman before the fete. Yet more than one villager insists you spoke with her at length. I told you, Inspector, it was a brief exchange. She asked for directions." "Directions rarely take 10 minutes, Crail pressed, "and Mrs. Arbuthnot swears you looked as if you knew one another." Denham flushed. "Mrs. Arbuthnot exaggerates. I did not know her. I had no reason to." At that, Mrs. Denham interjected suddenly, her voice sharp. "Really, Inspector, you are badgering the boy. He has told you all he knows." Crail turned to her. "With respect, madam, sometimes family loyalty blinds us. If your nephew did know the woman, however slightly, it is better to admit it now." But Mrs. Denham's lips pressed into a thin line, and Denham himself avoided the inspector's gaze. Miss Marple, who had come by with a jar of quince jelly quite by chance, observed silently from her chair. She noticed the way Mrs. Denham's hand rested on her nephew's shoulder, protective, almost desperate. There was a secret there, she thought, one that bound them both. In the evening, at the Bluebell Tea Room, Mrs. Price Ridley regaled her companions with yet another theory. The woman was clearly blackmailing someone. Why else come uninvited? And blackmail always ends in murder. Mark my words, she came to St. Mary Mead with mischief in mind, and it caught up with her. Miss Hartnell sniffed. If you ask me, it was something to do with Colonel Arbuthnot. Did you not notice how flustered he was, fussing about his garden? I have long thought there was more to the Colonel's past than he lets on. Colonel Arbuthnot is a man of principle, Miss Larkin insisted, though without conviction. But Mrs. Arbuthnot, she is so particular. People who are too particular are often hiding something. All that order, all those lists. What are they for, I ask you, if not to conceal a disorder elsewhere? Theories clashed, reputations were bruised, and long-standing grievances disguised as observations were brought forward under the convenient umbrella of suspicion. What began as speculation about the stranger soon broadened into commentary on nearly everyone in the village. It was in this atmosphere that Miss Marple heard something that pricked her attention like a needle through cloth. A maid from the Arbuthnot's household, passing through the tea-room, mentioned that Mrs. Arbuthnot had been in tears over a missing trinket. It was not the missing handbag, but something else. A piece of jewelry gone astray during the confusion. The maid thought it was a brooch. Miss Marple's thoughts returned at once to the pearl brooch she had seen on the dead woman. A piece very like it had been offered at the church bazaar months ago. Could it be the same? And if so, how had it come to rest on the stranger's collar? That evening, Miss Marple called upon Mrs. Arbuthnot under the pretext of returning a book. She found the lady pale but composed, her movements precise as always. Over tea, Miss Marple remarked casually, "I heard you lost something of value during the fete. That must be upsetting." Mrs. Arbuthnot hesitated. Yes, a brooch. It was a small thing, really. Pearls in a wreath. I'd placed it in my dressing room, and after the fete it was gone. I do not know how it could have been taken. Pearls in a wreath, Miss Marple repeated softly. How very pretty. I believe I saw such a brooch, 564, though not where one might expect, on the lady who died. Mrs. Arbuthnot's teacup rattled against its saucer. On her. Are you certain? As certain as one can be, Miss Marple replied gently. Perhaps she borrowed it, or was it given to her? Mrs. Arbuthnot's face tightened. Number, it was mine. I never lent it. How she came to have it, I cannot say. Miss Marple let the matter rest, though she noted the agitation in the woman's voice. A brooch was transferred from one woman to another. It spoke of a connection, one that Mrs. Arbuthnot was unwilling to confess. Meanwhile, Inspector Crail, though still fixed on Reed and Denham, was forced to acknowledge the new threat. If the brooch was stolen, we must ask who had access to the Arbuthnot's rooms, he said. Servants, visitors, and family. It broadens the net. Miss Marple, listening, thought otherwise. It did not broaden the net. It narrowed it. For only certain hands would pass a brooch from one woman to another in such a way. Not theft, but transfer. And transfers, she knew, were rarely innocent. As the day drew to a close, the mist lifted and the sky revealed a pale moon over the rooftops. The village, restless with talk, settled into uneasy slumber. But Miss Marple sat at her window, knitting laid aside, reflecting on the strands she had gathered, the Colonel's pocketed ledger, the dropped button, and the missing brooch. Small, overlooked details. Yet in those details lay the outline of truth. Secrets were stirring in St. Mary Mead. Confrontations had begun, and more would follow. The question was not only who the stranger was, but whose carefully guarded life she had come to disturb. For that, Miss Marple thought, was the heart of the matter. Murder seldom springs from strangers alone. It grows from the soil of old secrets, watered by fear and silence. 2 days after the discovery of the stranger's body, the village was roused again. Not by Inspector Creel's questioning, nor by the endless chatter in the tea-room, but by an event that turned every theory on its head. It began in the early morning, when young Tommy Clark, delivering milk on his bicycle, nearly toppled into the ditch near the station road. There, half hidden among the brambles, he saw a handbag. Word spread quickly. By the time Constable Reed arrived to collect it, half the village had already passed the news from one doorstep to another. The handbag, when brought to the vicarage for examination, proved to be a fine leather piece, worn but cared for, with initials stamped discreetly on the inside flap. E.K. Inspector Creel wasted no time. E.K., he said, tapping the leather with satisfaction. E. Kirby is the name in the fete ledger. At last, we have something solid. But the contents of the handbag raised more questions than they answered. There was a small purse with a modest sum of money, a London bus ticket stub, a handkerchief embroidered with the same initials, and, most curious of all, a folded letter addressed simply to dear Eleanor. The letter was unsigned, its words written in a careful, almost formal hand. You must not come here. It will only stir old wounds. Nothing can be gained and much may be lost. If you persist, I cannot protect you. The inspector read it aloud to the assembled group doctor. Haydock, the vicar, Mrs. Clement, the Arbuthnotts, and Miss Marple, who sat unobtrusively with her knitting in her lap. Well, declared Colonel Arbuthnot, that proves she was warned. Some foolish woman who wouldn't take advice, and look where it ended. Mrs. Arbuthnot said nothing, her face pale, her hands clasped tightly together. Miss Marple, however, was thoughtful. Letters can be curious things, she remarked softly. They tell us what is written, but also what is not. One wonders who had the power to protect her and from what. Inspector Creel, though not dismissing her words, was intent on pursuing the practical. We must trace this Eleanor Kirby. London police will help, but someone here must have known her. A person does not simply write to St. Mary Mead without a reason. The discovery of the handbag shifted the tone of gossip throughout the village. No longer was the dead woman an anonymous stranger. She had a name, Eleanor Kirby, and perhaps even a history that touched St. Mary Mead. By afternoon, Mrs. Price Ridley was certain she had once heard of Eleanor Kirby staying at a boarding house in Much Benham years ago, though she admitted she could not recall the details. Miss Hartnell, not to be outdone, insisted that she remembered a Kirby family from Bath, distantly connected to the Larkins, though Miss Larkin hotly denied any such connection. The Arbuthnotts, too, seemed unsettled by the name. When Miss Marple visited their garden later that day under the pretext of admiring the roses, she found Mrs. Arbuthnot unusually distracted. The lady's composure was fraying. Her hands shook slightly as she adjusted her gloves. "Such dreadful weather," Miss Marple said kindly, glancing up at the gathering clouds. "I do hope it does not spoil the roses." Yes, the roses," Mrs. Arbuthnot replied vaguely. "One does what one can, but the rain spoils everything." Miss Marple let her talk, observing her agitation. At last, in a low voice, Mrs. Arbuthnot said, "Did you see the letter, Miss Marple?" "The inspector showed it to us." "Yes. A curious thing, was it not?" Mrs. Arbuthnot's eyes darted away. Curious and tragic. To be warned, and yet to come. Her voice faltered. Miss Marple waited, but nothing more was said. She walked back toward her cottage with the sense that Mrs. Arbuthnot knew far more than she wished to admit. Meanwhile, suspicion around Evan Reed deepened. The gardener had been seen walking late in the evening near the very lane where the handbag was found. "What honest man has business there at that hour?" demanded Mrs. Price Ridley in the tea-room. "No one but a guilty one." Reed himself denied it calmly when confronted by Constable Reed. "I go where the air is fresh. A man can walk in the evening without it being a crime." But the inspector seized upon the coincidence. First mistaken for Sims by the victim, then seen near the lane where her handbag turns up. "You must admit, Reed, the pattern looks damning." Evan Reed's eyes flashed. "I've done nothing wrong. You can look at me all you like, but you won't find what isn't there." Miss Marple, hearing of this exchange later from Mary, felt a tug of pity. Reed's defensiveness was not the bluster of guilt, but the bitterness of a man too often judged. Still, she tucked away the fact of his evening walk. People chose their times and places for reasons, and those reasons were rarely without meaning. That evening, another ripple of surprise ran through the village. The vicarage received a message from Much Benham Police that a woman named Eleanor Kirby had indeed lived in the area some years ago. She had been employed as a companion to an elderly lady, but had left suddenly after a scandal, though the records were vague as to its nature. Miss Marple sat quietly as the vicar read this aloud, her needles clicking steadily. "Scandal," she repeated. "How very suggestive. Such matters rarely disappear entirely. They have a way of lingering, like smoke long after the fire." Mrs. Clement, troubled, asked, "Do you think, Jane, that Eleanor Kirby came back because of that old scandal?" "Perhaps," Miss Marple said softly. "Or perhaps she came back because someone feared she might." The revelation of Eleanor Kirby's name and past altered the whole course of speculation. Where once the villagers had spoken of strangers, now they spoke of old connections, of things done years before and remembered still. Who had written the warning letter? Who had wished to keep her away? And why had she persisted, only to die at the fete? Inspector Crail remained focused on Reed and Denham, but Miss Marple felt the circle was wider. The Arbuthnot's unease and the Colonel's quickness to dismiss Mrs. Arbuthnot's trembling hands were not the marks of bystanders. The past had touched them too, she was certain. That night, as she sat by her window, the village lay quiet under the moon. The handbag and letter had given the victim a name, but they had also deepened the mystery. For identities, Miss Marple knew they were never so simple. Names could be worn like coats, letters could be written to conceal as much as they revealed, and scandals could be forgotten by some while remembered all too well by others. She folded her knitting neatly and whispered into the silence, "It is not the name that matters, but the role she played." And someone here in St. Mary Mead knows exactly what that role was. The village of St. Mary Mead seemed, in the days that followed, to take on a peculiar duality. Outwardly, it remained much the same. The sound of children playing in the lanes, the ring of the blacksmith's hammer from Much Benham carrying faintly on the air, and the Sunday bells tolling their familiar rhythm. Yet beneath this gentle surface, every glance held a question, every conversation a double meaning. Suspicion had seeped into the very soil. The name Eleanor Kirby was on every tongue, though half the villagers insisted they had never heard it before, and the other half were equally certain they had. Some claimed to remember a quiet companion in Much Benham. Others whispered of an indiscretion hushed up, though no one agreed on its nature. The only certainty was that she had returned under one name or another and had met her end in Colonel Arbuthnot's garden. Inspector Crail, ever methodical, pressed on with his inquiries. He had written to London and was awaiting replies, but in the meantime he fixed his sights firmly on Evan Reed and Mr. Denham. "One of them knows more than he admits," he told the vicar one evening, his heavy brow furrowed. "The girl spoke to both. The gardener is evasive, the young man nervous. Between the two, we shall find the truth." The vicar, with gentle patience, suggested that human nature was seldom so neat, but the inspector preferred a tidy box into which suspects could be placed. Miss Marple, however, had grown increasingly certain that the truth lay not in the obvious suspects, but in the quieter corners. People reveal themselves in small ways, she murmured to Mrs. Clement over tea. A borrowed trinket, a letter hastily folded, a mistaken name. Such details are more reliable than speeches. Her opportunity to test this belief came sooner than expected. Mrs. Arbuthnot, usually so composed, called at Miss Marple's cottage one afternoon. Her appearance was strained. Her gloves, always immaculate, were fastened crookedly at the wrist. "My dear Miss Marple," she began, attempting lightness, "I thought perhaps you might spare me some of your rose cuttings. Our borders look quite forlorn this year." Miss Marple, who had never known Mrs. Arbuthnot to care a whit for rose cuttings, welcomed her in and poured tea. They spoke of flowers for a few minutes until at last Mrs. Arbuthnot's composure cracked. "Tell me," she said abruptly, "do you think Eleanor Kirby came here deliberately? Or was it some dreadful accident that brought her to our fate?" Miss Marple studied her carefully. "People rarely come by accident, Mrs. Arbuthnot, especially not to a village fete. They come because something draws them." Mrs. Arbuthnot pressed her lips together, then whispered, "If I had known she would come, if I had known, I would have done anything to prevent it." She rose swiftly, as though the admission had been wrenched from her against her will, and departed before Miss Marple could ask more. That evening, Miss Marple sat quietly in her garden, knitting untouched in her lap. Mrs. Arbuthnot's words rang in her ears. "I would have done anything to prevent it." The tone had not been of hatred, but of fear. And fear, Miss Marple knew, was often more dangerous than anger. The next day brought further complications. Inspector Crail received word from London that Eleanor Kirby had once been engaged in a lawsuit of some kind, a matter involving disputed inheritance. The details were vague, but it suggested she was not merely a companion, but a woman with claims that may have threatened others. This revelation stirred new currents in the village. "Inheritance," Mrs. Price Ridley repeated in the tea-room, her eyes gleaming. "That explains it all. She came here to claim money or property. People kill for less." Miss Hartnell countered that perhaps Eleanor Kirby had intended to expose someone's past. "Scandal is worse than money, if you ask me. Once a thing is whispered, it grows until it consumes." Amid this storm of speculation, Miss Marple chose a different course. She began making her visits not with direct questions, but with gentle observations. She asked Mrs. Denham if her nephew was eating well, and noted the aunt's nervous reply. She inquired of the maid at the Arbuthnot's house whether the colonel often misplaced things, and learned that his study drawers were frequently left unlocked, his papers scattered in disorder. She visited Dr. Haydock with a basket of scones, and heard him remark, quite unprompted, that the knot in the scarf had been tied with the skill of one accustomed to secure bandages or fastenings. Piece by piece, the picture sharpened. Yet it was not complete. It was on Sunday after church that Miss Marple decided upon her final test. Standing in the churchyard, surrounded by the usual exchange of greetings, she spoke in her mild voice to no one in particular. "Such a pity," she said, "that poor Eleanor Kirby should have worn Mrs. Arbuthnot's brooch on the day she died. It must have been given to her by someone who wanted her to feel welcome." The words were simple, almost idle. Yet Miss Marple watched closely. Colonel Arbuthnot merely harumphed, distracted by his umbrella. Mrs. Arbuthnot, however, went pale as linen and dropped her hymn-book. Evan Reed frowned in confusion, while Mr. Denham's eyes widened with something like alarm. It was a small reaction, fleeting, but Miss Marple had seen what she needed. The brooch was no accident. Its presence on Eleanor Kirby's dress was deliberate, and Mrs. Arbuthnot's fear betrayed the knowledge of how it had come there. That evening, Miss Marple sat with her cocoa, reflecting. She had begun her test, and the reactions had been telling. Yet she was not ready to reveal her conclusions. The time was not ripe. There were still threads to untangle, still another twist to come. For murder, she knew, was rarely a simple act. It was the culmination of secrets, fears, and choices made long ago. The village slept that night, uneasy beneath the weight of suspicion. But Miss Marple, ever patient, waited. Her final test had begun, and soon enough, the true face behind the game of misplaced identities would emerge. The quiet of Sunday evening did not last long. By Monday morning, the village was once again buzzing with fresh rumors. The discovery of the handbag and the mention of inheritance had given the gossips new fuel, and in St. Mary Mead, fuel burned quickly. People leaned across fences and paused longer than necessary at shop counters, each anxious to repeat what they had heard or to embellish it with details of their own invention. Inspector Crail, however, was less amused. He had spent a restless night considering the evidence, and by breakfast time he had resolved to narrow his circle further. This Eleanor Kirby, he declared at the vicarage, where he had summoned his confidants, had some claim money, perhaps property, and she came here to press it. That much is certain. The letter proves she was warned off. Therefore, whoever wrote it feared what she might reveal or demand. That is where we must look. Colonel Arbuthnot, stiff in his chair, muttered, "I knew no such woman. Neither did my wife. If she had claims, they were nothing to do with us." His voice, though firm, held a faint tremor, as if the mere suggestion of involvement offended his sense of order. Mrs. Arbuthnot sat beside him, her face pale but carefully composed. Only her hands betrayed her agitation, fingers twisting her handkerchief until the lace began to fray. Miss Marple, sitting quietly in her usual place, noted this detail without comment. She had long since learned that hands tell the truth even when lips do not. The inspector turned next to Mr. Denham. "You spoke to her. You must have heard something. Did she mention a claim or a connection here?" "No," Inspector Denham replied quickly. "I told you. She asked the way to the station. That was all." "Yet you looked uneasy when her name was read," Crail pressed. Denham flushed. "I was surprised, that is all. The name sounded familiar, but I did not know her personally." From the corner, Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly. She said nothing, but her eyes rested on the young man. Surprise, she knew, can be genuine, but it can also mask recognition. Evan Reed, summoned as well, remained silent for most of the exchange. When asked directly if he knew Eleanor Kirby, he shook his head. "She called me Sims, that's all. Mistakes me for the old gardener. I never knew her." Inspector Crail scowled. "Yet you were seen near the lane where her handbag was found. What were you doing there?" "Walking," Reed said simply. "A man can walk." The inspector dismissed him with irritation, but Miss Marple's thoughts lingered. Reed's answers were short, almost sullen, yet not evasive. It was the response of someone weary of being suspected rather than of someone concealing guilt. After the meeting broke up, Miss Marple walked home with Mrs. Clement. The vicar's wife, her brow furrowed, said softly, "Jane, do you believe either of those young men guilty? I cannot bring myself to think it of them, though the inspector seems convinced." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "It is not always the obvious suspect, my dear. Young men may look guilty because they lack the polish to disguise their nerves. But true guilt, that is another matter. It lies in small details often overlooked." That afternoon, the village saw another development. Dr. Haydock, after examining the scarf again, remarked to Inspector Crail that the knot was not only precise, but bore a peculiar feature. It had been tied in a way commonly used by nurses or companions accustomed to securing garments quickly yet firmly. "It is not a knot one sees every day," the doctor explained. "Practical, efficient, but unusual. It suggests a habit." The inspector frowned. So the killer was someone with such training? A nurse? A lady's companion? "Possibly," Dr. Haydock said. "Or someone who had lived closely with such persons." This information spread quickly, and by evening, Tongues wagged with renewed vigor. Miss Hartnell insisted it proved Eleanor Kirby herself had tied it and been caught in some struggle. Mrs. Price Ridley countered that it showed the killer had once been in service. Miss Larkin claimed that Mrs. Arbuthnot had once been a companion before her marriage and therefore must know such knots. This last suggestion, whispered with relish, was repeated more widely than most. When word of this reached the Arbuthnots, Colonel Arbuthnot's temper boiled. "Insufferable nonsense," he thundered. "My wife's reputation is maligned by idle gossip. Inspector, you must put a stop to it." Mrs. Arbuthnot, however, retreated to her room, pleading fatigue. Alone she sat before her mirror, her hands trembling as she removed her broochless dress. The reflection that stared back at her seemed pale and unfamiliar. "Eleanor," she whispered under her breath, "why did you come?" Meanwhile, Miss Marple made her quiet rounds. At the post office, she inquired gently whether Miss Pottle had seen any unusual letters posted before the fete. Miss Pottle, eager to oblige, recalled a letter in a plain envelope with no return address, sent to London and posted by a gentleman at least. I think it was a gentleman. She could not be certain of his name, but she remembered that he had worn gloves, which struck her as odd in warm weather. At the tea room, Miss Marple listened as Dora Prescott described the chaos of the fete. Dora remembered that when the raffle books were gathered, one page was smudged with ink, as if someone had hurriedly written with a damp pen. It was, she thought, the page with the name E. Kirby. Miss Marple tucked these fragments away, storing them as carefully as her skeins of wool. The pattern was beginning to form. A borrowed brooch, a warning letter, a nurse's knot, a smudged page, all pieces of a puzzle that pointed toward intention, not chance. That evening at the vicarage, Miss Marple spoke softly to Mrs. Clement while the inspector reviewed his notes. "Have you ever noticed, my dear, how often people try to change their names? It is not so difficult, really. One may call oneself Kirby or North or anything one pleases. But the habits of a lifetime are far harder to change. The way one ties a knot or the way one clasps a brooch, those are the things that reveal the truth." Mrs. Clement regarded her with wide eyes. "Do you mean you know who?" Miss Marple smiled kindly. "Not yet, but I believe we are very close. There is still one thread to follow, and then the picture will be complete." Outside, the village lay under a heavy stillness, as though holding its breath. The inspector believed the net was tightening around his two suspects, Reed and Denham, but Miss Marple knew better. The true net was elsewhere, invisible but strong, woven from the smallest of clues. And soon, very soon, it would draw tight around the one who thought themselves safe. The week wore on, and with it the village of St. Mary Mead seemed caught in a state of suspended animation. The shops bustled, the children played. The church bell tolled the hours, yet an undercurrent of unease threaded through every daily routine. It was as though the entire place waited for a curtain to lift, revealing what had been hidden in shadow. Inspector Crail continued to build his case against Evan Reed and Mr. Denham. He was a man who trusted evidence that could be written neatly in a notebook, and the evasions of the two young men fitted his conception of guilt. Reed had been near the handbag. Denham had spoken to the woman, and both had looked uneasy under questioning. To the inspector, it was enough. But Miss Marple was not satisfied. Uneasiness could come from many sources, and suspicion had a way of settling on the young because they lacked the careful polish of age. She had learned over her long life that true guilt did not always reside in the expected places. It showed itself instead in the way someone's hand trembled when a name was spoken, or in the hasty concealment of a trivial object. It was with this in mind that Miss Marple invited Mrs. Arbuthnot to tea one afternoon. The invitation was couched in the mildest terms, an offer of fresh scones and a new recipe for jam. Mrs. Arbuthnot arrived, her manner polite, though her eyes carried the shadow of unrest. Miss Marple poured tea and spoke of roses, of parish matters, of the coming harvest festival. Only after several minutes did she remark, with her usual air of innocent observation, "I thought it so curious, dear, that poor Eleanor Kirby should have been wearing your brooch. Such a pity, for it was such a lovely piece. One wonders how she came by it." Mrs. Arbuthnot's teacup clattered faintly against its saucer. "I cannot explain it," she said too quickly. "I told the inspector as much." "Yes, of course," Miss Marple agreed with gentle sympathy. "But I could not help thinking it must have been given to her. Brooches do not leap from one woman's dressing table to another's collar of their own accord. They are fastened by hand, by someone's hand." For a moment, silence pressed down. Then Mrs. Arbuthnot said, with forced calm, "I cannot think what you mean, Miss Marple." "Perhaps she stole it." "Perhaps," Miss Marple allowed, though her eyes, kind and mild, studied the woman's trembling fingers. When Mrs. Arbuthnot departed soon after, Miss Marple sat quietly, reflecting. The woman was frightened, not angry. That distinction mattered. Anger accused, but fear concealed. Later that day, Miss Marple set in motion a small but deliberate plan. She called upon Inspector Crail at the vicarage and suggested, with her usual deference, that a further gathering of those most concerned might be useful. "You see, Inspector, people often say things in company they would never say alone. It is a curious truth of human nature." Crail, though skeptical, agreed. And so, on the following evening, a small circle assembled once more in the vicarage study. The Arbuthnot's, Mr. Denham with his aunt, Evan Reed, Dr. Haydock, and, of course, Miss Marple herself. The inspector began with his usual questions, but Miss Marple, seated with her knitting, waited for her moment. At last she spoke, her tone mild and conversational. "It struck me," she said, "that poor Eleanor Kirby must have been rather flustered at the fate. She dropped a button, you know, Mrs. Clement saw it, a dark button, very distinctive. Such small things tell us much, don't they? Where a person has been, what they wore, even what company they kept." She paused, letting her words hang in the air. Mrs. Arbuthnot's hands twitched in her lap. Colonel Arbuthnot shifted uncomfortably. Denham looked puzzled, while Evan Reed frowned in concentration. Miss Marple continued, her voice still soft, almost reflective. "And then there is the letter. So curious, isn't it? You must not come here. Nothing can be gained, much may be lost. If you persist, I cannot protect you. Such a letter could only have been written by someone with a personal connection, someone who had something to lose." A hush fell over the room. The inspector opened his mouth, but Miss Marple went on before he could interrupt. "And of course, there is the brooch, that pretty wreath of pearls. Such things do not walk away on their own. They are given, or returned, or perhaps exchanged." Mrs. Arbuthnot rose suddenly, her face pale. "I cannot bear this," she whispered. Colonel Arbuthnot leapt up. "My dear, sit down. There is no need." But Miss Marple's gentle voice cut across his bluster. "You see, Colonel, it is not a matter of strangers at all. It never was. It is a matter of identities borrowed, misplaced, and exchanged. Eleanor Kirby came here not as an outsider, but as someone known. Someone connected to this village and to its people through ties they thought long buried." Her needles clicked once more, steady and calm. "The truth," she said softly, "is always present in the smallest things. A knot tied too neatly, a brooch worn by the wrong woman, a name written in a hand that did not belong to the writer. These are the threads that bind the whole together, and it is through such threads that we shall find the one who killed her." Inspector Crail stared at her. "Do you mean you know who did it?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Not yet, Inspector, but we are very near. All that remains is to wait for one final slip. and I believe it will come soon." The meeting broke up shortly after, tension hanging heavy in the air. Colonel Arbuthnot escorted his wife away, his face grim. Denham and his aunt departed in silence, while Evan Reed gave Miss Marple a long, searching look before following them out. Alone again, Miss Marple folded her knitting neatly. Her trap had been set, though gently, like a net laid across a woodland path. The reactions had been plain for her to see. Fear, confusion, agitation, each had spoken more loudly than words. She sipped her tea thoughtfully. The net was tightening, but she would not pull the threads too soon. No, she would wait. Human nature, she knew, was far too restless to keep a secret under pressure. The murderer would reveal themselves, not by force of questioning, but by the small, inevitable slip that always came when the game of identities grew too tangled to sustain. And when that moment arrived, Miss Marple would be ready. The inspector had grown impatient. It was nearly a week since the fete, and though the villagers still whispered theories with undiminished energy, no arrest had yet been made. Inspector Crail was not a man who enjoyed delay. "We must act," he told the vicar one evening at the study table, his notes spread before him. "The evidence against Reed or young Denham will do. We cannot have murder unsolved in a village of this size. It emboldens the guilty." Miss Marple, who had been invited by Mrs. Clement to share tea, looked up from her knitting. Her expression was mild, but there was a firmness behind her voice. "Forgive me, Inspector, but I do not think it will do at all. You see, you are looking at what is easiest, not what is truest." Crail frowned. "And what do you suggest is truer, Miss Marple?" "That we are not dealing with a crime of strangers, but of connections," she said gently. "Eleanor Kirby came here because she knew someone, or because someone feared she might reveal what was long concealed. In such cases, it is never the obvious suspect, but the one who profits most by silence." The inspector gave a gruff sound, half exasperation, half reluctant curiosity. "And who do you say that is?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Perhaps we might allow the matter to reveal itself. People, when pressed gently, will betray themselves more surely than any evidence in a notebook. Might I suggest a gathering? All those concerned in one room. It is remarkable what truth will surface in company." And so it was arranged. The following evening, in the vicarage study once more, the circle gathered Colonel and Mrs. Arbuthnot, Mr. Denham with his aunt, Evan Reed, Dr. Haydock, and the inspector. Mrs. Clement poured tea, her hands steady though her eyes were anxious. The inspector began briskly, but Miss Marple raised a hand. "If I may, Inspector, I would like to ask a few questions, only very small ones." He sighed, but gestured for her to proceed. Miss Marple's tone was as mild as if she were inquiring about the weather. "It has puzzled me, you see, about that brooch. Such a pretty piece of pearls in a wreath. I remember it well because it was offered as a prize at last year's church bazaar. Mrs. Arbuthnot, you won it, did you not?" Mrs. Arbuthnot gave a start. "Why, yes, I did. I had quite forgotten." "Indeed. And yet the very same brooch was pinned to Eleanor Kirby's collar when she died." The room fell still. Colonel Arbuthnot shifted heavily in his chair. "Then she must have stolen it," he said gruffly. Miss Marple's blue eyes rested on him. "Or it was given to her, given by someone who wished to bind her silence or reassure her of welcome. But there is more. The knot in the scarf is so neat, so professional. Dr. Haydock remarked that it resembled the fastening used by a nurse or a companion. And Eleanor Kirby, before the scandal that drove her away, had once been a companion." Mrs. Arbuthnot's hands trembled, though she clasped them tightly in her lap. Miss Marple went on, her voice calm, her needles clicking softly. "And then there is the ledger. 2 names written in a hurried, smudged hand, Mrs. North and E. Kirby. Curious, is it not, that neither had an address? almost as if the entries were added later to suggest her presence was legitimate. That is the work of someone who had access to the ledger after the fete, and who wished to give the impression of formality where none existed. Inspector Crail leaned forward. "Are you saying, Miss Marple, that the Arbuthnot's?" But Miss Marple continued, undisturbed. "Finally, the letter. You must not come here. Nothing can be gained, and much may be lost. If you persist, I cannot protect you. Such words are not written by a stranger. They are written by someone with a personal tie, someone who feared exposure, someone for whom Eleanor Kirby was not an interloper but a ghost from the past." All eyes turned to Mrs. Arbuthnot. Her face was white, her lips pressed thin, and her body rigid in the chair. At last she spoke, her voice strained. "You cannot know. You cannot understand." Miss Marple's voice was quiet, almost pitying. "On the contrary, my dear, I do understand. You were once Eleanor Kirby. It was you who lived in much Benham as a companion, you who left in disgrace when scandal threatened. You remade yourself as Mrs. Arbuthnot, a lady of dignity, wife to the Colonel, and mistress of this house, and you feared above all things that the past would return. But it did return on the arm of the woman who bore your former name." Mrs. Arbuthnot's teacup slipped from her hands and shattered on the floor. She made no effort to deny it. Colonel Arbuthnot half rose, his face a mask of shock. "My wife, Eleanor, what is this?" Her words came in a rush, as though long damned and now released. "She was my sister, my half-sister. She bore the name I had cast off, and she threatened to reveal what I had done. I took her in that garden to beg for her silence, but she would not. She said she would expose me and ruin everything I had built. I only meant to silence her for a moment, to frighten her, but when I tied the scarf, I pulled too tightly." Her voice broke into sobs. The room was heavy with silence. Inspector Crail sat back, stunned, his pencil idle in his hand. Miss Marple folded her knitting, her eyes full of quiet sadness. "It is always the small things that betray us," she said softly. "A brooch, a knot, a smudged entry. Identities can be changed and names can be borrowed, but habits and fears remain." And it was in those small details that the truth revealed itself. Mrs. Arbuthnot sank into her chair, weeping quietly. Colonel Arbuthnot stood stiffly beside her, his face set in a grim mask. The inspector at last found his voice, ordering the constable to take charge. But Miss Marple only sighed, a deep, weary sound. For though justice would now take its course, she knew well that tragedy in human life was never so simple as guilt and innocence. It was always a tangle of pride, fear, and choices made long ago. The confession of Mrs. Arbuthnot rippled through St. Mary Mead like the tolling of a funeral bell. The inspector had scarcely left the vicarage with his prisoner before word began to spread. The villagers did not wait for official announcements. By morning, the entire parish knew, or believed they knew, exactly what had transpired. Each telling was embroidered with flourishes of imagination. Some insisted Mrs. Arbuthnot had fainted dead away in the vicarage study, while others claimed Colonel Arbuthnot had drawn a pistol on the inspector in a fit of outrage. The truth, quieter and sadder, was that she had wept softly, her hands folded in her lap, while her husband stood rigid beside her, his face carved in stone. In the shops and at the tea-room, the talk was endless. Mrs. Price. Ridley declared she had always suspected Mrs. Arbuthnot, though she could not point to any prior statement of such suspicion. Miss Hartnell, not to be outdone, recalled a moment during the fete when she had thought the lady looked pale and restless, and I said to myself then, something is wrong. Dora Prescott went further still, insisting she had overheard an argument between the Arbuthnot's and the stranger, though no one else had noticed such a thing. Through it all, Miss Marple moved quietly about her business. She made no pronouncements and offered no opinions. She watered her roses, mended her lace curtains, and received callers with her usual mildness. Yet those who came to her cottage for comfort, for many did find her words calm and steadying. "It is always sad," she said more than once, "when the past is not allowed to rest." Secrets, like weeds, will grow if they are not dealt with, and they will choke the flowers around them. Colonel Arbuthnot bore the scandal with grim dignity. He did not leave his house in the days that followed, save once to walk in his garden with his pipe clenched in his hand. Some said he spoke not a word, others said they saw him muttering to himself. The truth, Miss Marple guessed, was that he was a man betrayed by his own need for order. He had believed in neatness, in duty, and in the respectability of his household. Yet beneath that carefully tended surface, there had been a story untold. A wife who was not who she claimed to be, and a past that could not be erased by marriage and social position. Mr. Denham, for his part, seemed almost relieved. Though he had been shadowed by suspicion for days, the revelation freed him from that burden. Still, his aunt could not resist remarking to the grocer that the poor boy was dragged into it unjustly, and such things can damage a young man's prospects. Evan Reed, too, walked with his head a little higher, though suspicion clung to him still in some quarters. People in St. Mary Mead were slow to forget gossip once spoken. Inspector Crail, though gratified at last by a confession, did not appear altogether satisfied. He was a man who preferred cases that ended tidily, and this one had ended in tangled sorrow. He admitted privately to the vicar that he would never have suspected Mrs. Arbuthnot without Miss Marple's gentle insistence on small details. "She sees through them like a needle through cloth," he said, shaking his head. "Not the way we police are taught at all." In the evenings that week, the vicarage grew quiet again. The study, once filled with anxious gatherings, now held only the ticking clock and the smell of old books. Mrs. Clement often thought of Mrs. Arbuthnot's final words, her broken admission that she had only meant to silence her sister, not kill her. It haunted her, the thought that desperation could drive even the most respectable of women to such an act. As for Miss Marple, she reflected not only on the crime, but also on the nature of identity itself. "We are none of us fixed," she remarked one afternoon to Dr. Haydock, who had called to check on her roses under the pretense of concern for her health. "We change names, change homes, and change the way we dress or speak, but character remains." Mrs. Arbuthnot was always the companion, always the careful, fearful woman trying to keep order against the chaos of her past, and Eleanor Kirby, poor soul, was always the reckless one, unwilling to be silent. Their quarrel was inevitable. The doctor grunted. "It's a grim business, but you're right. People don't change at the root. They are what they are." The funeral for Eleanor Kirby, if that was indeed her true name, was sparsely attended. A plain service at the Much Benham Church, with only a few curious villagers and the vicar present. Mrs. Arbuthnot, by then under guard, could not attend, and the colonel stayed away, perhaps out of shame, perhaps out of dignity. Miss Marple, sitting quietly in a back pew, bowed her head not only for the dead, but for the living, for the wreckage left behind. Life in St. Mary Mead slowly resumed its ordinary rhythm. The children returned to their games, the gardens to their tending, and the tea-room to its chatter. But an air of unease lingered, like the faint smell of smoke after a fire. People remembered that even in their quiet village, with its neat hedges and orderly routines, tragedy could bloom as swiftly as roses after rain. For Miss Marple, it was not a matter of triumph. She did not rejoice in having seen the truth where others had not. Instead, she sat by her window with her knitting, thoughtful and a little sad. "Human nature," she murmured to herself, "is the same everywhere, whether in London, Bath, or St. Mary Mead. Pride, fear, jealousy, and desperation they drive people, no matter what names they call themselves." As dusk fell and the church bell tolled the hour, Miss Marple folded her knitting and poured herself a small cup of cocoa. The garden beyond her window was peaceful, the roses glowing faintly in the twilight. Yet she knew well that beneath any peaceful surface lay the tangled roots of human lives, hidden scandals, quiet betrayals, and small vanities. It was in those roots that crimes were born, and it was there that the truth must be sought. The game of misplaced identities had ended, but the lesson remained. People might change their names, their appearances, even their roles in society, but they could never truly change what lay within. And Miss Marple, with her gentle eyes and steady patience, would always be there to see it.